Hi, everyone who's joining us. My name is William Smith. I'm the editor of Art in America magazine. And I'm really happy to be presenting this Zoom panel today based on our ethics column that we've been running monthly in the magazine called Hard Truths. And I'm joined by our columnists, Howie Chen and Andy Lampert, and our special guest, Dana Kopel, who is an editor at the New Museum, an Art in America contributor, and an expert on museum ethics and organizing. So I did want to start with Howie and Andy, just so we could get a sense of where you guys are coming from with this column. So first of all, how did this column come together, and why does the art world need an ethics column?
Good question. It's interesting to think about ethics in an arena where ethics aren't required. And so as long as they're not necessarily decorum, how does one know when you've breached them or what the invisible rules are? Because it's not completely lawless. The laws just aren't posted on signs, and there's no written contracts, as there aren't with actually, generally speaking, with artists between galleries. There's no contracts for ethical behavior. So, I think that that's something that has been a defining problem of the pre-corona art world. And Howie, what do you think?
Well, maybe just to give some context, Andy and I, we have a consultancy. We actually are consultants and art strategists. We have kind of a business that's really kind of unique in the space of art. We used to work at institutions. I think combined we have 20 years of institutional work. Me at the Whitney Museum and other places, and Andy at Anthology Film Archives. We've kind of wore a lot of other hats in the meantime. So we started this business because we were already doing a lot of freelance work, from curatorial strategy, curatorial research, to just even putting out flyers for individuals, galleries, and museums. So we came together and started Chen Lampert, which is the consultancy.
We in fact, one of the things that bonded us most is that in the gray area of what's a favor and what's a job within the art world, we both found ourselves as former dependents and independents, getting questions constantly that would in any other field be jobs. And here it was hitting people up with text messages or emails. And we both felt that, you can't quite invoice somebody if you're giving friendly advice. But if you think about it, this may not actually be a friend. It's an acquaintance, which is another aspect of the art world that holds true, is that the community is not a necessarily close-knit one. It's people you've met in bars or at parties or in crowds at openings. And that leads to a lot of, we're going to talk about labor as part of this, a lot of thought sharing that's happening. And Howie and I both felt at a certain point, because of a number of situations, that we needed to actually partner up and incorporate to have a place to stand in defense of being brain-picked by so many people.
Yeah, in a way, it is protective, or in a way, it's also defining. And I think there's so much casual labor and cognitive labor in the art world that by hanging a shingle or having a website or being incorporated, it defines, it defines what's happening when we are in the space of work and transaction, and when we're not in the space of transaction. Obviously, we don't want to charge our friends, or there are spaces in which we want to exchange ideas freely, but a lot of it is Chen Lampert's kind of birth is from our origin is from that. And I think and then I think we set out together to think about that, like in that context, like we want to solve art problems, and we're not here to, and with the angle that we care about the ecology of art and what sustains art, which is artists, and the kind of institutions and the apparatus. but we are pro artists and we pro art ecology. And I think that that is the difference between maybe an art consultancy and kind of the tradition, or even a consultancy in a traditional sense. So Hard Truths is really, the column is really an extension of kind of like the problem solving aspect, but it's kind of like manifested in a different kind of way. It's in a magazine, it's written with a voice. It's big-hearted, but we also wanted to solve problems and confront, you know, the glaring truth that seems like to us really obvious, and I think it's obvious to a lot of people, but it just needs to be said and put to words.
I write a lot, but I've never had a writing partner. I'm actually curious, having worked with you guys over the course of the last year, what is your process for coming up with these columns, and how do you give advice? You said it was obvious, but a lot of these questions are really complicated and in ethical gray areas. So, you know, you mentioned the idea of creating a protective shell to avoid exploitation and brain picking, and that was one of the questions that your column addressed. How do you, as a young curator, avoid being taken advantage of and having your ideas stolen essentially by someone else? So how do you guys work? What do you actually do? Go behind the scenes of Chen and Lampert and Hard Truths for a little bit.
Well, with Hard Truths, because again, it's one aspect of the different jobs that we take on. We've worked for, as the consultancy, you know, side of us with a number of different institutions, individuals, even some galleries. But with this, you know, upon receiving a question or being given a prompt for writing, Howie and I have developed, we didn't know this at the start, but we've developed a very fluid writing style that, and I had never written with anybody before, and certainly never written an ethics column. And had to think through the actual logistical steps that are involved with answering a question from a stranger submitted anonymously. And, you know, the column itself has a, you know, humor and it's flippant, but like Howie was saying, the idea of getting to something that's a true answer, that demonstrates heart and actual thought, not just a sick burn. That has been something that between the two of us, I feel like we have worked on the most. And the process itself of writing is of, you know, sharing documents. And, you know, if we read a column of ours a month or two later, it may be hard to know who wrote which word. We're completely open with each other and have never had, to my knowledge, my memory at least, a dispute about anything. I think what we're really particular about, though, is particular word placement. I mean, we try to write tight. We don't want to be particularly edited, and also
I love it. I love to hear that as an editor.
I hate edits.
Well, I hate edits, but I feel like that the truth is also housed in the humor. So if the humor gets changed, even for a grammatical or punctuation reason, it can alter the meaning. And so that's a big thing with us.
Yeah, I think with this column, I think what we're trying to do is, you know, there are big kind of like big brushstroke hotspot issues that we can identify in the art world. Let's say the candors issue or the anti-union situations in museums, or, you know, like different types of board you know, contradictions and problems. But I think what our column kind of underlines the kind of micro contradictions that happen in everyday life that adds up to the larger problem. So for instance, like our first column was about an artist who was torn about participating in a solo exhibition at a museum that is being protested. So it's a big issue, but the micro kind of like reasonings is where you can actually see under the hood how somebody ends up going along with something or saying no to something. And I think that's where, like, you know, a lot of the things are reported in our press are kind of big brushstrokes, but it's the little compromises and little consolations and reasonings that we're trying to kind of lift to the surface. And I think like the comedy part is a lot of times it's the little reasonings are so unreasonable that they appear to be absurd. And we try to escalate that, you know, why one like for instance, there's another article about how an adjunct teacher feels really ashamed and terrible about taking on another job that's so underpaying and so tolling on his or her life. And we walk through why one would say yes so easily, knowing that it's against their interests. Like, why do we work against our interests, our political interests, our own personal interests? And I think with these questions, as maybe mundane as they are, like I can't paint or I don't have an idea, it reveals the kind of micro situations that all of us deal with every day.
And I think that the column expresses two ideas that we sort of have a lot of, comes up a lot with us, is that within the art world, every tier of it, there are actually a limited amount of problems, and that they take on different colors and manifestations and faces. But between management or mismanagement of nonprofits and museums, pay disparities, the emotional and sometimes abusive relationships between employer and employee, artist and artist assistant. These are situations which repeat themselves ad nauseum in the art world. And that's why Howie and I, as consultants, one of the things I feel like we've been here for the most to do in terms of helping people is learn how to say no. Is when is enough, and to not quit, but when to walk, and what is it you really want, and what's the real fight to be had, and where is the pressure coming from? These are all things that we think about a lot, and instead of embracing always the power of positive yes, maybe no is a more persuasive answer.
And in terms of writing together, actually, we've gotten a lot of practice. We actually wrote a full commission self-help book together. It took us a whole year, and it was commissioned by Badlands, and it was ill-fated for many reasons, many to do with the publisher. But we learned a lot in the process. We learned how to write together. We learned how to get together and to think about large problems about the art world, like which we never really thought about in terms of like help. Systemically. Yeah, and then I think like we were able to kind of get over the fact that this book was, eventually never was published. But that was a lesson that we are incorporating into this. Is like that things that what we've learned is that in the art world, the art world is about representations, right? That's why we're in the business or in the field of art, is that we make representations and images. I think the problem is when art intersects with politics or ethics or morals, is that representations may not be enough. There's not much accountability for, let's say, if you're a political artist, if you're an identity-based artist or you're about justice, you kind of need to be accountable. And I think that's where the gap, that very gap is the very crisis of art right now, because there's so many promises, there's so many stakes, there's so many claims that that's where we're working in between. It's like to identify kind of like, and to hold people accountable. And I think it's like, you think about Goop, right? Gwyneth Paltrow's Goop. That whole culture, that whole situation is like you can use a jade stone for different objects, or you cannot use vaccines, but those are things you put out there to morally signal something, but doesn't mean is never followed up with any kind of accountability, whether it scientifically holds water or whether it's actually beneficial. And I think that we kind of have that problem with critique or institutional critique or political figurations of the artists, or or even socially engaged artists. We need to see kind of, in a way, we need to hold people accountable. And I think that becomes true with like something like labor and inequality in the arts, or whether museums claim to be social or cultural sanctuaries. If they do claim that, then we have to think about if that's true. Like, so I think that's the distance that's happening in the space of art.
I was looking back on all of your columns, and I think one big theme has to do with rationalization, and how you touched on this a little bit earlier. How can you rationalize the small compromises that are involved in working in the art world? And I think this process is necessary in part because the industry is driven by the sense of passion, the idea that people want to be here, that they're doing work that they love, and so might be willing to put up with certain conditions in order to have that really close personal bond with the work that they're doing, the idea that they're expressing themselves through their work. We see this in a lot of different industries. The idea that you're supposed to do what you love is fairly widespread, but probably maximized in the art world to a certain extent. So where do you draw the line? I mean, what for you guys, if we're talking about hard truths, what are the red lines here when doing what you love crosses over into exploitation or something unacceptable?
Good question. I mean, you could even start that question not just in the art world, but in art school and, you know, graduate programs in particular in terms of, you know, paying to play. I've been thinking actually about this because one thing I think that, you know, Art in America could do is have a feature on art in, let's say, Kansas City or Tulsa, or places that are not New York, Los Angeles, California, you know, or common places in which art is reported, and that in shifting the focus on where and how we find and discuss art and what we define as the art world, that may be one way to instantly provoke change versus focusing on a system of sort of control that begins with reporting on and talking about, and in a sense, creating aspirations towards gallery representation and major museum exhibitions in cultural hubs. I'm not calling out Art in America in particular. I'm just saying I wonder how, in a re-stratified art world, we can reposition where we want to be by thinking outside of the walled city that is the art world as it stands. I don't know if that's actually an answer to your question, but it's something that this whole conversation just started making me think about. Why the art world is located where we find it, and if after Corona, there are opportunities because of layoffs, because of the downsizing that will follow, that if in the restructuring of things, there's another way, and not from the top down, but maybe from the user level or the participant level up, to think about exploitation and participation. Those are sort of two different matters.
Yeah, I think the moral of the story, piggybacking off of Andy's comment, is that there is an outside. You know, I think the art narrative that we have come to inherit, you know, sacrifice yourself for what you love, art, you know, the starving artist, those narratives are really strong, and I think it persists. You know, whether you're an art administrator, whether you're an artist, to an assistant curator, like you're there putting in the hours because you're doing what you love, and you know, that gets exploited in different ways. And I think what I think is good, I mean, it's not about drawing lines, it's about like recognizing that narrative, and that, you know, you're you're your best exploiter, you know, like in a way. So I think, you know, I've been on the board of Wage for quite some time, and I recently stepped down.
Could you just explain what that is?
A Wage is it's a group, it's an advocacy group that advocates for artists being paid whenever they perform labor and content, or give content to museums and nonprofit organizations. And it's been, I think, one of the most effective kind of nonprofits and advocacy groups in the space of art. Mainly, I think, not only because it gives kind of like, it gives concrete reasons why you would want to ask for to give value and to ask for payment when you do something for a company or a nonprofit. And I think the other thing that's really great about it is that it does kind of like question the narratives. Like, does this narrative, is it in the best interest of you or artists in general? It kind of lifts the veil on that narrative of exceptionalism of being in the arts and exceptionalism of being an artist. So I think that's what we try to do too with Hard Truths. Like, the hard truth is that it's a story, but if the story ends up being kind of like something that kind of shackles you in some kind of way, then you would want to break free from it, or you want to rewrite the story in some kind of other way.
I think about one thing that we've ruminated over a lot in the last 4 or 5 years is the idea of having a show at a gallery or a show at a coffee shop. You have a show at a gallery, and the works are priced at a certain level that won't embarrass the gallery, but which may be above your realistic market. If you stand in Chelsea, the Lower East Side, on a Wednesday in one place, and you watch how many people go in and out of a gallery, you'd be shocked at how few actually see your work if you're the artist on display. If your work was hanging up at a coffee shop where the work could be purchased from the barista at a price that was achievable for most people, and you think about how many go in and out each day and actually while in line see your work, what is the better show? The one where you have sales and make less money, or the one where you're in a supposedly prestigious spot that gets less attention? And let's assume, because most shows, the majority of shows don't get any press review at all. So what is the best situation? And I think now that we are kind of facing a new reality, this is another important question for me to raise in terms of autonomy, and in terms of a question I would ask most artists is very few people actually have art problems. Very few people have actual art careers. Most people's problems are trying to have art careers. Art problems are very much problems of successful people. People who consider themselves not successful because they're not in the so-called commercial gallery world, or not getting exhibitions through often very cronyism related relations that end up in museum exhibits. What is it that you want from the so-called art world, and what is it that you want in terms of an outlet to share your creativity? So that's a new dynamic.
That's
Let me jump in here for a second, because I do want to turn the conversation to some specific hard truths. And I feel like everyone has a little bit of a background now on the column that you've been doing, and you can see all or most of them up now at Art in America's website. I wanted to turn to Dana Kopel, who has a lot of experience on the front lines grappling with some of the ethical issues that we've raised so far, especially issues of accountability and trying to make sure that institutions live up to the promises that they make. So Dana, do you want to talk a little bit about your work at the New Museum and with the New Museum Union? And then I'll turn things over to Howie and Andy.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me as a special guest. It's really nice to talk with you all. I guess I was one of the organizers of the New Museum Union. I've worked at the New Museum for about 3.5 years. I'm currently furloughed. We had our vote to unionize in January of 2019, so we've been unionized for over a year now. As far as I know, is the first major museum unionization in several decades, since basically MoMA and SF MoMA unionized in the 70s. And yeah, I think the thing I always say that feels really important to say is, like, I'm one person here, and I was very involved in the organizing. I was on the bargaining committee, and I'm now the unit chair. But a union is a collective effort. It's no one person. So there's just like an enormous amount of people that made that possible and continue to make it possible. There are 2 other stewards, and a number of other people that were on the bargaining committee. It's extremely a collective effort. So yeah, I guess one thing that I've been thinking about just based on the conversation now is what Howie said about the gap between like representation and practice. I think that was really something that spurred us to unionize, particularly at the New Museum, where there is this very sort of like visible progressive mission. And that's something that the museum really uses and profits from. And for many of us that were working there, contrasting that with the internal dynamics and the way workers were treated was really disorienting and depressing. And so that was a big part of what spurred us to unionize, and it's a big part of like my thinking about ethics in the art world in general. Sort of the way contemporary art and contemporary art institutions in particular put forward this sort of like progressive or occasionally like radical politics, and in fact sort of treat their workers like shit, don't pay their artists, things like that. I think it's just like this gap between sort of surface level politics or the representational politics and the internal or like what I would call actual politics. And I think that's, for me, that like the union has been a way of intervening in some of that in this very specific context of the new museum.
I'm curious what things look like moving forward for the union. I would suspect that a lot of the people listening in have some of the basics about how the union was founded and some of the issues that led to it. But the status of it at the present moment and looking in the months ahead might be a little bit murkier. Do you have any insights there, Dana?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I feel really grateful to have a union right now. This is like, I mean, everyone needs a union always, but this is like a time when it's really useful to have sort of like a collective body that's like capable of advocating for you and your rights at work. So we, as I said, we unionized over a year ago. We won our first contract in October of last year. So when this all happened, we had a contract in place, which means we had things like severance provisions in place. So people who were laid off didn't have to go into conversations individually and try to like advocate for themselves. Like that was all built into the contract already. Right now, you know, it's like a really insane time. But we have a support system. Like we have ways of communicating with each other. We've been hosting town halls with all of our union members where we like share information about unemployment and what's going on with healthcare. And also having a union means that we are like legally able to bargain with the museum over the impact of layoffs and furloughs. And so, you know, they can decide based on like what they say is necessary, whether to lay people off or furlough them. And they really did lay off or furlough the majority of our union. It seemed very targeted in that way. Most people in management still have their jobs, but of our 84-person unit, there are 7 people still on staff. So that's really unfortunate, but we do have the capacity to bargain. We've been in a long conversation with the museum trying to get vital information to do that. Really basic stuff like exactly who is furloughed, who is laid off in the unit and outside of the unit, because that's how we're able to tell whether these are fair or not. You know, if they're keeping someone in management and getting rid of someone in the union when they're doing similar work and they're claiming that that work doesn't exist, it sort of like doesn't make sense. We've asked for information like whether the museum has applied for any of the like federal grants or loans that are intended to keep people on payroll. They're refusing to tell us that. But this is a process and we are hoping to negotiate with them. And yeah, I mean, that's just something that a union can do that non-unionized workers don't have access to.
I'm curious to hear from all of you about what you think needs to happen for arts institutions, museums like the new museum to reopen effectively? Even the nuts and bolts of this, and what needs to be in place for that to happen? Are these institutions going to be coming back in the same way? And what kinds of reforms do you think need to be developed now, so that we can have more equitable or ethical, let's say, arts institutions in the future? Or is the hard truth that it's going to be worse?
Well, that's the hard truth that we start from. But I think it's really interesting to ask us, because two of us are independents and one of us is furloughed, and that as Dana seems to be suggesting, to ask higher up what the plan is isn't there aren't any answers coming back down. I'm getting one email a week from MoMA with what's going on at MoMA. I'm not being flooded with things. Many of the institutions whose email lists I'm on, I haven't been hearing from lately. So I would think that any museum institution, small nonprofit that is active right now is gearing towards online. And it is going to mean a lot more after, Madoff has happened too. After the Madoff scandal, museums and institutions resorted to a lot of collections shows, because as money wasn't coming in and as these institutions have stockpiled work for decades, it was easier to go within. At a place like the New Museum, that may not be an option. Depends, of course, on what the mission of your institution is. And I do think that this may be a moment that signals the shift between objects and between media. I think that the rise of museum patronage is going to become an online and media-based experience, at least in terms of where the resources are going to go for a lot of places. And of course, one of the big questions there is, where does this situate education departments and publication departments and other aspects that are very much related to in-person and relational programming, to something that's central? Now that everything's so schismatic and schizoid, how are these departments going to work together within each institution? That's a question I have.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with Andy that things will get worse, and that's the hard truth we have to start from. I think we're already seeing that, most institutions, whether they need to or not, are adopting this intense austerity model where they're dropping most of their staff, they're closing things down, and it's going to harm a lot of people. I think in general, the way to deal with that is to organize. I think artists and art workers need to organize, and it's hard to unionize right now, but it's so important. And also just to build other forms of mutual aid and networks of solidarity, where we're actually building power as workers to defend our jobs and make sure that this isn't something where the museum reopens with half staff and everyone's getting paid even less than they were before, which was already not enough to live on. I think also, this is something I mentioned in the Essence piece that I wrote recently, but in terms of the move online, I guess I'm hopeful that that continues in a sustained and thoughtful way, because a lot of people I've spoken to have expressed sort of a lot of frustration with institutions that refuse to make things accessible by putting them online for people who physically can't be at the institution, or need closed captioning, things like that. And that's incredibly important. And now, now that it's not just some people, it's everyone that can't be in this space, that's been prioritized suddenly. And I hope that continues to be prioritized even when some people can make it back into museums.
One other thought here is that in terms of the physical experience, I'm putting restaurants before museums. and other conveniences that I think museums aren't going to lead the field in figuring out how we can come together once again. But I think the biggest casualty here may be, and not to name names, but I think in every field of the arts, from you know, film and video and you know, screen printing and bookmaking, a lot of not-for-profits are going to fall. And in fact, a lot of the legacy ones, which maybe have outstayed their welcome, but have been with us forever, so we think of them as institutions, may crumble as well. But one of my questions I have is in terms of funding cycles, either emergency relief or the kind of blanket federal, state, or philanthropic support that they get. What are these institutions who do survive going to have to do to still be receiving the kind of level of support they did either pre-corona or whatever they need now to exist? Because it's going to involve so many new initiatives. And many nonprofits don't have 5-year models. They have an idea of, let's say, maintenance. It's not about growth. And if it is about growth, maintenance is the daily responsibility. So many places run so tight, even the ones we value most. You'd be surprised. And why do they run tight? Well, often you'd have to look at the salaries of their employees to understand that it's kind of altruistic in some people's sense to work there. And I am curious how and what funders are going to ask for and require to continue their patronage of these places. And if we might see another shift, we're talking about shifts before, and where money is going and who or what places maybe get a different or not even just a second chance, but get a chance compared to places that we all know and are familiar with, but which have long not been serving their mission and have continued to exist because they're simply around.
I think my biggest fear, and I hope this doesn't happen, is that institutions double down on their pre-COVID kind of models, the kind of like, you know, the expansionist, the neoliberal model, but also claiming the social, cultural, notional sanctuary to the other of the terrible political, social world outside. And I think what's really come to the fore is, especially with COVID, is that, you know, these tensions and contradictions are untenable and they're in plain sight. So that to come back after the virus and to reopen and to reboot everything as if nothing happened and use the online experience as a way of just wrangling more people and more numbers, I think that would be the worst case scenario. I think the best case scenario, they would, you know, institutions recognize it's the time to regroup and try to shore up if they are going to follow this narrative of being progressive, socially and culturally, that they make sure that is thoroughly, you know, registering at all levels. Not only the artists that they choose, you know, make sure that the artist they choose is not like a Bono who's beating puppies in secret, you know, but also somebody that actually is doing something that people can identify with, and it's true, but also the way they treat everybody within the organization and the audiences. And that also speaks to, you know, the access to the work and the information too. So I think, like, if institutions don't, I think, reform, I think people will start working around institutions. And I think, like, I know, seeing Dana's piece in Essence, which is it's an e-commerce platform, but it has, like, actually a very interesting kind of like editorial component to it, that for me to find that article on that platform, you know, it was kind of, it stuck out to me, like that, you know, that was a decision to publish there, but also why an e-commerce site would publish basically a kind of pretty radical institutional critique. It won't sell more Margiela sneakers or any, you know, but in a way, if institutions don't reform, there are other ways in which people will work around it, or they'll find spaces that actually have less contradictions. Like perhaps the e-commerce space has less contradictions than a museum claims to be progressive. So, that's the upside down world that we kind of are facing. So I think like if we can minimize contradictions in all of our practices, whether we're Chen and Lampert or within the union or whatever efforts, I think, and that's institutionally too. I think that will better the ecology if there is truly an ecology.
Let me get to some of the questions that have been rolling in here. And there's one that I think it might be interesting to hear Dana address. Aaron Murphy is asking about essentially who can afford to work in a museum. And maybe this relates to a point I was talking about earlier about how these jobs are framed as passion projects. And so all sorts of financial sacrifices are suggested by that, but never explicitly stated. And Aaron says, sometimes it feels like the people who can afford to work for nothing, who can afford to say yes because they don't have to worry about money, shelter, food, etc., ruin it for other people who are trying to get into this field. What are your thoughts on this? And how can we move forward knowing that these people will always be around?
Yeah, I mean, completely. Like, I know this is like a huge point of discussion for us as we were talking about unionizing throughout the process. I think there was a lot of recognition among like many of our union members that like we were able to take these jobs for particular reasons. Like I don't have student debt. Like I could afford to get paid like shit. And like that ultimately like creates an art world that like many of us like were extremely frustrated with and didn't want to see, where like people are like fundamentally excluded at these early points from like getting a foothold because they can't afford to take these jobs, or they can manage and then they're treated like shit and they like feel like they have to put up with it. So I think like, not to be like unionized all the time, but like I am, that's kind of my thing. But I think unionizing, I mean, we brought the salaries up significantly, and we really did that with like an attention to the lowest paid people in our unit. People were getting hired at $35,000 a year, and like people on visitor services and the store, which are also like within the new museum at least, and I think not just, those are the most like racially diverse departments within our union. Like they were getting paid $15.50 an hour, which was 50 cents more than minimum wage, and that's what they've been paid for over 3 years. So focusing on like bringing those salaries and those wages up in our contract negotiations was like specifically intended to try to like ultimately reshape the kind of art world that we're in, that we're working in. I know we talked before about this idea of like doing what you love, and like we're lucky to have these jobs because we want to work in the art world. Like I'm sort of like morally opposed to the idea of doing what you love. Like a job is a job, and it's great if like it doesn't make you miserable all the time, but like you're like trading your labor for money, and like frankly for less money than you're producing. And so yeah, I think like the idea of doing what you love like creates a lot of really toxic and exclusionary conditions.
And actually, there's a related question here. Thanks for that answer, Dana, from Tassif Noor, asking about the art workers transparency sheet for salaries, which was like a Google Sheet database that was going around where people sometimes anonymously, sometimes not, posted what they were being paid in an effort to increase transparency. And Tassif says, I think this helped art workers and institutions build solidarity with one another because it helped lift the veil on how salaries and roles are broken down. How do we help art workers build solidarity with artists?
I mean, I think that's a really good question, something I've been thinking about a lot. I think like unions, for instance, are specific to shops in many cases, at least ours is, and many like museum unions are. And so it is just the workers, and we've had like throughout the process of organizing and contract negotiations, we had like enormous support from like artists in the new museum community, for lack of a better term, who like really showed up and like signed a letter like in support of us, and like joined social media campaigns and were like literally walking like outside with us when we had our rally in June. But I think there's, yeah, and I think there's also like initiatives like Wage, which do a lot to support artists and like provide advocacy for them, but like there is definitely like a bridge there that's missing. And like, yeah, it feels really crucial to think more holistically about like art ecosystem as like artists and art workers. And there's also a lot of overlap. I mean, like many people who work at museums are also artists separately. But yeah, but what that looks like, I mean, that's a big question.
Yeah, I think, you know, we thought a lot about this within Wage when we were coming up with a fee calculator, which basically is a resource for artists to refer to think about what the bare minimum they should be getting paid across the whatever type of work they're doing for the industry. And in that way, we felt like that calculator or the spreadsheet that's happening, you know, in different circles and different fields, is a way of creating a type of notional solidarity. It's like, okay, we're not going to do this under this. There is a line in which you don't cross. And I think to create solidarity between artists and art administrators or different people in different parts of labor, I think it really is to revive this notion that there is a picket line. There is a line in which you don't cross. You know, like if a museum there's something funny going on, you don't go there for a second, you know, like until, you know, or you help amplify, you know, whatever that you feel is unjust about it. And you can hold off on going to an opening or hold off on seeing a mirror room or something, you know, like, so I think like it is that type of solidarity really comes down to the micro part of it. It's like, maybe you don't have to go there today, or you don't have to do that right now.
I think really one of the only true things that can create solidarity is that in all the different tiers, from artist to arts administrator to curator to director, it has to be everybody being demoralized. I don't think there's a raising up. I think that everybody actually has to fall down on top of each other to realize how circumscribed these roles are and how cross institution, doesn't matter if you're at MoMA or SF MoMA or at the, you know, Butte, Montana of cowboy art, you're going to have hierarchical issues that make people who are in middle management positions feel that they could be working anywhere. I just happen to be working at an arts institution. And so when you think of it that way, and I would wonder, do the people who are at institutions actually think that they're there to work with artists or to support artists? And is that in any way what they are told that their mission is? Is that an internal thing that one brings to their job because of a passion, like, you know, the one that Dana spoke eloquently against having? Or is it something that the institution itself claims to do? I do not see many of these institutions outright saying our job is to build a bridge or create a solidarity with artists. Most of them seem to have a job of presenting performance or moving image or other artists for one day out of a month, or to have an exhibition that lasts 3 months for a particular artist who might be receiving support through collector or galleries that are behind them. And so I do wonder, in terms of between ticket sales and attendance and those types of records that they track, where and how do they even begin to quantify how they're doing when it comes to supporting and creating a solidarity with artists? So I think perhaps by everybody being so demoralized, it could potentially, I have low hopes for this, to be honest, but it could potentially spark a conversation that would be more productive than saying we're here for artists.
Yeah, one of the most bummer situations I think we've encountered when kind of arguing for fair artist wage would be, and it's happened, a curatorial person says, well, we as art administrators don't get paid well. We should get paid why would we want to pay artists, or to that effect, like how can we even give more to the artists when we don't get paid well ourselves? Maybe that's the more real life. And I think that is the kind of demoralization. While we're going to just kind of punch down or be a bunch of kind of like catfish fighting each other. But I think the other way should be like, well, I want to pay this artist. It's going to stretch my budget because I recognize that we're in the same labor situation where we're getting underpaid, and that we should find solidarities through the misery of not being compensated for our labor, and not like us versus them. Artists aren't difficult in that sense of wanting to get paid. It's more that everybody is so down and out.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's exactly what solidarity is. Sort of like, oh, I'm getting fucked over and this artist is getting fucked over, and like together we can like stop getting fucked over and sort of look up at like where the money is actually going, and it's like the director's $800,000 a year salary, rather than being like, you have like these crumbs and I have these crumbs and like I want yours or whatever.
Yeah, if everybody wears a mask outside, people won't get sick as much. But only if some people wear a mask and some people don't and go to the Hamptons to hide out, it's not going to work as well, right? So that's the thing, is like everybody needs to get in and help out a little bit.
We're getting so many great questions, but we're also running out of time. So I think maybe what I want to do is steer some of these over to the actual column so that we can have them addressed by Chen and Lampert at some later date in print, or host another discussion along these lines. I thought it was a really fruitful conversation. Thank you, Dana, for joining us this evening. Thank you to Howie and Andy for all the work that you do. Please, everyone, check out their column at Art in America's website. And thank you all for attending this evening.
Oh, Dana, how can we support what how can we support what you're doing? What mutual aid projects can we do?
Oh yeah, thanks, Howie, for jumping in on that.
Yeah, first of all, follow New Museum Union on Instagram and Twitter. It's at New Museum Union. There's an underscore before union on the Twitter, I'm pretty sure. We're easy to find. And I personally have been doing some mutual aid stuff. I think if people are in a position to give money to support mutual aid initiatives, especially sort of like less established, like nonprofits, like people literally just like buying groceries for their neighbors, or like getting masks to people who need them, like do that. In general, as you were saying, Howie, like don't cross the picket line. There's a lot of workers are like being treated really horribly right now. Essential workers, people doing deliveries for Amazon, people working at Target, Whole Foods. There's a big strike on May 1st, like basically a general strike, which is really remarkable, to sort of, for these workers to get things like protective equipment and hazard pay and things like that. So when that happens, like never cross the picket line.
Well, I think we have to leave it there for this evening. So thanks again. I wish I could offer everyone little plastic glasses of wine and seltzer water and cheese and stuff, but instead I'm just gonna click the red button in the lower right hand. Disappear.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Bye.
Bye.